I woke to the feeling of my own heart trying to kill me. The pain hit like a fist, closing around my chest from the inside. I gasped and reached for the nightstand where I always kept my emergency medication. My fingers found nothing. The pill case was gone. I remember thinking I must have knocked it off in my sleep, so I rolled sideways and tried to reach the floor, but the pain doubled me over before I could get there. I crawled to the bedroom door and grabbed the handle. Locked. From the outside. I pounded on that door with whatever strength I had left. My knuckles barely made a sound, and then I heard her voice on the other side. Calm. Almost bored. My half-sister Evelyn, standing right there in the hallway, close enough that I could hear her breathing. "Do you really think someone who only has a name on a birth certificate has any right to hold company shares?" Then footsteps. Walking away. No rush. No hesitation. Like she had just closed a window because of a draft. I collapsed onto the cold hardwood floor and pressed my cheek against it, trying to slow my breathing the way the doctors taught me. From the living room down the hall, I could hear the television playing some cooking competition. Diane laughing at something. A cousin asking if there was more wine. The whole family carrying on like nothing was happening. Like I was not 30 feet away on the floor of my dead mother's old bedroom, unable to breathe. My vision went dark at the edges. My last thought before I blacked out was simple and terrible. This is how I die, in my father's house, surrounded by people who want me gone. But what Evelyn did not know, what none of them knew, was that our father had spent the last year of his life preparing for exactly this moment. And in 1 week, everything they built on silence and cruelty would collapse in front of federal investigators. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Alexandra Pembroke. I am 37 years old, and I work as a real estate broker in Sacramento, California. Everything I have, I built from nothing. No family connections, no trust fund, no phone calls from Dad's business partners offering me a shortcut. I learned early that my last name did not open doors. If anything, it reminded people of a family I was never truly part of. My mother died when I was 9. Hereditary cardiac arrhythmia, the same condition that would come for me decades later, like a debt passed down through blood. My father remarried within 2 years. Diane brought order to the house and warmth to the dinner table, or at least that is how it looked from the outside. What she actually brought was distance. She rearranged the furniture first, then the photographs, then the memories. Slowly, carefully, she turned my mother into a ghost that no one in that house was allowed to mention. Then, Evelyn was born, the golden child, the real daughter. I could see it in the way Diane held her, the way she talked about her future, the way every room seemed to rearrange itself around Evelyn the moment she entered. I was the leftover, the reminder of a previous life my father was trying to forget. By the time I left for college, the message was clear. This family had moved on. I was a chapter they had already closed. So I built my own life. Never asked for money. Never asked for a seat at the table. Told myself I did not need either. For a long time, I almost believed it. Then, 1 month ago, my heart betrayed me. I was showing a property in Midtown Sacramento when the floor tilted sideways and my chest locked up like someone had poured concrete into my lungs. Emergency room. Tests. The diagnosis landed like a verdict. Hereditary cardiac arrhythmia. The same condition. The same gene. The doctors prescribed daily medication and strict rest. No stress, no exertion, no negotiation. And then my phone rang. It was Diane. Her voice was warm, which should have been my first warning. "Come home, Alexandra. Recover here. Your father wants to see you. We are family." I wanted to believe her. That was my first mistake. I arrived at the family house in Marin County on a Thursday afternoon. The property sat on a hill overlooking the bay, worth several $1 million and surrounded by the kind of silence that money buys. Inside, everything looked the same as I remembered. Expensive furniture, polished floors, family photographs covering every wall and mantel. Not a single one included my mother. Every trace of Caroline Pembroke had been scrubbed from this house years ago. I noticed. I said nothing. I had always said nothing. Dinner that first night told me everything I needed to know. Diane sat at the head of the table in my father's chair. Evelyn dominated the conversation, talking about the family real estate company, the upcoming shareholder restructuring. Words like equity reallocation and voting rights and board seats tossed around like they were passing the salt. My father sat at the other end. He was thinner than I remembered. He ate slowly and said almost nothing. He looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than his body. I tried to ask him about his health. Diane cut me off before I finished the sentence. "He is fine. We handle everything here." Conversation over. Evelyn turned to me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "It is so good you are here, Alex. We should talk about your shares in the company. With the restructuring coming, it might make sense for you to let us manage your portion. Less stress while you recover." It sounded reasonable, generous even, but underneath the polish, I felt something else. Urgency. They needed me to sign something, and they needed it soon. That night I passed my father's study on the way to bed. The door was open. He was sitting alone at his desk, staring at a stack of papers. He looked up when he saw me, and for one moment his eyes filled with something raw. Guilt, fear, sadness so deep it looked like drowning. He opened his mouth. I waited, then Diane's voice from upstairs. "Robert, come to bed." He closed his mouth, looked away. The moment died between us, like a candle pinched out. I went to my room and lay in the dark, heart pounding. Not from my condition, from the look on my father's face. He had been about to tell me something that scared him. Over the next 3 days, the pattern locked into place. Diane controlled all access to my father. Evelyn controlled the narrative. Every conversation circled back to the company, the shares, the restructuring. They handed me documents to sign, dense legal paperwork about transferring my voting rights to Evelyn temporarily during the transition period. I read every word. I was trained to read contracts, and buried deep in the language, past the standard clauses and the reassuring headers, I found it. A provision that would permanently dilute my ownership stake to below 5%. They were not asking me to step aside temporarily. They were erasing me from the company entirely. I brought it up at dinner. Evelyn did not even blink. "That is just standard legal language, Alex. You are overthinking it. Your heart condition is making you anxious." Diane nodded. "Focus on resting, sweetheart. Let Evelyn handle the business side." I looked at my father. He stared at his plate, said nothing. That night, past midnight, I got up for water. Passing Evelyn's bedroom, I heard her voice through the door. She was on the phone with Diane, who had gone to stay at a friend's house for the evening. Evelyn's tone was low, sharp, stripped of every polite pretense I had ever heard from her. "Everything has to be finalized before Dad changes his mind. If she does not sign by Friday, we go to Plan B." The call ended. I stood frozen in the dark hallway, barely breathing. My heart was pounding again, but this time it had nothing to do with my condition. Plan B. I did not know what it meant, but standing in that hallway, surrounded by the silence of a house that had never wanted me, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. They did not invite me home to heal. They invited me home to finish me off. I found out my father was dead from an email, not a phone call, not someone sitting me down with soft words and a glass of water. An email. 3 sentences from Evelyn, sent at 6 in the morning like a calendar reminder. Dad passed in his sleep last night. Funeral arrangements are being handled. We will send details. I read it sitting on the edge of a hospital bed. I had been admitted 2 days earlier after Margaret Chen, the neighbor from across the street, saw me through the open bedroom window lying motionless on the floor. She called 911. The paramedics broke down the locked bedroom door. The doctors told me later that another 10 minutes without intervention, and the cardiac episode would have caused permanent damage. Maybe worse. When I told the attending physician what happened, that someone had removed my medication and locked me inside the room, he stared at me for a long time and then made a note in my chart that I did not get to read. He suggested I speak to someone from the hospital's social services department. I told him I just needed to rest. What I actually needed was to get out of that house alive, which I had apparently managed by a margin of minutes. And now my father was gone. I sat with that email on my phone screen for what felt like an hour. I kept reading the words, "passed in his sleep," and trying to feel something specific. Grief, relief, rage. What I actually felt was numb, like the news had landed in a part of me that had already gone dark a long time ago. I drove to Marin County for the funeral. The house was full of people I barely recognized. Distant relatives, business associates, neighbors carrying covered dishes. Diane stood at the center of it all in a black dress that fit like it had been tailored for this occasion. She greeted guests with the composure of someone hosting a charity benefit. Her eyes were dry. Evelyn moved through the rooms like a campaign manager. She coordinated catering, directed the florist, managed the guest list. She had organized the entire funeral without consulting me. My father's only biological daughter, and I learned the burial time from a group text. When I walked through the front door, Diane looked at me the way you look at someone who showed up to the wrong party. "Alexandra, I was not sure you would make it. How is your health?" Not how are you? How is your health? Like my body was a liability she was assessing. I told her I was fine. She nodded and turned to greet someone more important. I stood in the foyer of my childhood home, holding my purse and my medication, and understood that I was a guest at my own father's funeral. The service was tasteful, expensive, and completely controlled. Diane spoke first. Then, Evelyn. They described a loving husband, a devoted father, a brilliant businessman. They talked about his final months with tender detail, how they fed him, bathed him, managed his medications, sat with him through long nights. The narrative was seamless, the grieving widow and the faithful daughter, united in sacrifice. Nowhere in their version of events did I exist. After the service, people gathered for dinner. I sat at the far end of a long table and listened to relatives murmur about how wonderful Diane and Evelyn had been, how selfless, how strong. One of my father's cousins leaned over and said to me with genuine curiosity, "I did not know Robert had another daughter." I smiled politely and excused myself. That was when Grace Holloway found me. She caught my arm near the back hallway, pulling me into the shadow of the staircase. Grace was in her early 60s, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, a woman who had worked at my father's real estate company for over 15 years. I remembered her from my rare visits over the years. She had always been kind to me. Small kindnesses, a cup of coffee without being asked, a quiet, "Your father talks about you more than you think." Her eyes were red, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "Alexandra, listen to me carefully. Your father prepared for this. Do not believe anything they tell you about the will or the company. He made arrangements. Do you understand?" Before I could respond, she looked past me, saw someone coming, and let go of my arm. "I cannot say more right now, but you will hear from the right people. Just hold on." Then she walked away and disappeared into the crowd, like she had never spoken to me at all. I stood in the hallway trying to process what she said. He prepared for this. What did that mean? And who were the right people? That night, after most of the guests had left, I walked past my father's study. The door was closed. I reached for the handle. New lock. Not the old brass knob that had been there my entire life. Someone had installed a deadbolt, shiny and industrial, within the past few weeks. Whoever did it was not trying to keep burglars out. They were trying to keep someone specific from getting in. I pressed my hand against the door and felt the cold metal of the new lock under my fingers. On the other side of that door were my father's papers, his files, his records, whatever he had been staring at the night he almost told me something. And someone in this house had made very sure I would never see any of it. I went back to Sacramento expecting silence. What I got was a campaign. It started with phone calls. My Aunt Patricia called first, her voice careful and overly gentle, the way people speak to someone they have been warned about. Diane mentioned you have been going through a difficult time. She said the medication for your heart has been affecting your mood. Are you eating? Are you sleeping? I told her I was fine. She did not sound convinced. 2 days later, my cousin Michael called with almost identical language. Had I been feeling stable? Diane was worried that the stress of the funeral combined with my prescriptions might be causing some confusion. He mentioned the word erratic without quite committing to it. By the third call, I understood what was happening. Diane was not just dismissing me. She was poisoning the well. One relative at a time, she was building a narrative. Alexandra is fragile. Alexandra is medicated. Alexandra is not thinking clearly. By the time any legal discussion about my father's estate began, the entire family would already believe I was too broken, too unstable, too desperate to be taken seriously. Evelyn took a different approach. She sent me an email written in the tone of a corporate attorney pretending to be a concerned sister. I understand you may have strong feelings about Dad's passing, and I want you to know that I empathize. However, I have been made aware that you have been making statements to family members that misrepresent what happened during your stay at the house. I want to gently remind you that defamation has serious legal consequences. Several family members are prepared to provide statements confirming that your behavior at the funeral was erratic and confrontational. I hope we can resolve this privately. Defamation, witnesses, legal consequences. She was not warning me. She was building a wall around whatever they were planning, making sure I would be too afraid to challenge it. I tried calling Diane directly. I wanted to talk about the estate, the company, the restructuring, anything, like adults. She answered on the fourth ring and cut me off within 10 seconds. We handled everything while you were absent for years, Alexandra. Every doctor visit, every medication refill, every single night. You do not get to appear now that there is money on the table and pretend you were part of this family. She hung up. I sat in my apartment staring at the phone. The worst part was not the cruelty. The worst part was the sliver of doubt it planted. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had been absent. Maybe this was the price of leaving. I tried to access the family company's internal email system, using the login my father had given me years ago. Access denied. The account had been deactivated 2 days after his death. Someone moved fast. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The days blurred together. I went to work. I showed properties to clients. I came home and sat in my apartment and took my heart medication and stared at the wall. I had no money for a lawyer. I had no evidence of what Evelyn did to me in that bedroom. I had no allies inside the family. Every relative had already heard Diane's version. Every door was closed. One evening, I sat on my kitchen floor, not because I was having an episode, but because the floor felt more honest than the couch. I held my pill case in my hand and thought about how easy it would be to let go. Not of life, of the fight. Just stop. Accept that they won. Accept that I was never meant to be part of this family, or that company, or any of it. Walk away and let them have everything. My phone buzzed on the counter above me. Unknown number. I almost did not answer. I am glad every day that I did. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, professional. A man who chose his words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. Alexandra Pembroke? My name is Daniel Wright. I am an attorney. I was your father's personal legal counsel for the last 14 months of his life. He paused just long enough for me to sit up straight. Your father contacted me because he believed his estate and his company were being systematically compromised by members of his own household. He spent the last year of his life working with me to prepare for exactly the situation you are now facing. My hand was shaking. I pressed the phone harder against my ear. I need to meet with you in person, Alexandra. Tomorrow, if possible. And I must ask you, please, do not tell anyone in your family that we have spoken. What I have to show you will change everything, but only if they do not see it coming. Daniel Wright's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown San Francisco. No name on the door, no receptionist making small talk. Just a quiet hallway, a closed conference room, and a man in his late 50s with silver hair and the kind of steady composure that comes from spending decades inside other people's worst moments. He shook my hand and gestured to a chair across from a long table covered with organized stacks of paper, each one tabbed and labeled. A laptop sat open at the center. He closed the door and sat down across from me and did not waste a single second on pleasantries. Your father came to me 15 months ago. He was frightened but lucid. He told me he believed his wife Diane and his stepdaughter Evelyn were working together to take control of his company and his estate. He suspected financial manipulation. He suspected document tampering. And he believed that if he confronted them directly, they would find a way to discredit him or remove his legal authority before he could protect you. He opened the first folder. Inside was a psychological evaluation dated 13 months ago. An independent, board-certified neuropsychologist. Not Dr. Leland, the family physician Diane controlled. Someone outside the family's orbit entirely. The evaluation confirmed that Robert Pembroke was of sound mind, fully competent, and capable of making legal and financial decisions without impairment. Your father commissioned this evaluation specifically because he anticipated that Diane or Evelyn would claim he was mentally declining. He wanted an ironclad record proving otherwise. Daniel opened the next folder. The will. My father's last will and testament, signed 12 months before his death, witnessed by 2 independent attorneys, notarized, and filed with the court. I read the key provision 3 times to make sure I understood it. 65% controlling stake in the family real estate company. Full authority over personnel decisions and financial operations. Ownership of the Marin County property. All of it left to me, Alexandra Pembroke, his daughter. I put the document down and pressed my hands flat against the table because they would not stop shaking. Daniel continued. But your father did not stop at the will. He knew a will could be contested. He needed more. He turned the laptop toward me and opened an audio file. My father's voice filled the room. Thin, tired, but clear. Every word deliberate. If this recording is being played for my daughter, then I am no longer alive to protect her myself. I need her to know that I am sorry. I was silent for too long. I watched them push her out, and I said nothing because I was afraid. But I have spent the last year trying to make it right. Everything she needs is in these files. Everything Daniel holds is for her. I covered my mouth with my hand. I had not heard my father's voice in over a year. The last time we spoke on the phone, Diane had interrupted within 2 minutes, and the call ended. I never called back. I told myself it was because he did not want to talk to me. Now I was hearing him say my name with more tenderness than I remembered from my entire childhood. Daniel gave me a moment. Then he continued. Your father also gathered evidence of financial irregularities inside the company.
He identified transactions that he believed were fraudulent, wire transfers to shell entities,
altered corporate documents, board votes that were recorded differently from how they actually occurred. Over the course of several months, with the help of a trusted employee inside the company, he copied the relevant files and transferred them to me. Grace Holloway, the woman at the funeral who whispered to me in the hallway. She was the insider. She had been helping my father all along. "There is more," Daniel said. His voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more careful. Like a man approaching a door he was not sure he should open. "During his investigation, your father discovered something about the origin of the company itself. Something he said he should have told you years ago." He opened a separate folder. The paper inside was old, yellowed at the edges. I recognized the format immediately because I had spent my career reading documents exactly like it. Articles of incorporation, dated 1994, the founding charter of the family real estate company. The initial capital investment was listed clearly, and the name on the investment account was not Robert Pembroke. It was Caroline Pembroke. My mother. Daniel spoke carefully. "Your mother funded the company's founding. Her personal savings, an inheritance from her parents, money she earned working before you were born. She was the financial foundation of everything the Pembroke Company became. After her death, your stepmother Diane systematically removed Caroline's name from all corporate records. Her investment was reclassified as a repaid loan, though no repayment documentation exists. Within 5 years, every trace of your mother's contribution had been erased." I stared at my mother's signature on the original paperwork. Her handwriting was neat, forward-leaning, confident. A woman signing her future into existence. A woman who would be dead 5 years later and forgotten 5 years after that. Daniel said quietly, "Your father could not bring himself to tell you while he was alive. He carried the guilt of allowing it to happen, but he made sure the records survived. He made sure I could show you." I sat in that conference room for a long time without speaking. I was not crying. I was past crying. I was somewhere deeper than that, in a place where grief and rage and clarity all exist at the same time, and none of them cancel each other out. They did not just push me out of this family. They erased my mother. They built everything on her sacrifice, and then pretended she never existed. Daniel closed the folder and looked at me. "There is one more thing. Before your father died, he authorized me to forward the financial evidence to federal authorities. They have been investigating Evelyn's shell company and the fraudulent transactions for approximately 6 months." He paused. "They have confirmed they will be present at the will reading and shareholder restructuring meeting scheduled for next Thursday." I looked at him. "Federal investigators." "Yes. This is no longer an inheritance dispute, Alexandra. They are treating it as financial crime." I drove home that night through the dark with my hands locked on the steering wheel and my heart medication in my pocket and my mother's name echoing in my skull. Caroline Pembroke, the woman who built everything and was rewarded with erasure. 1 week. In 1 week, I would sit across from the people who stole my mother's legacy, locked me in a room to die, and spent 20 years pretending I did not exist, and they would have no idea what was coming. Daniel and I spent the next 3 days pulling apart the financial skeleton of my family's company, bone by bone. His office became a war room. Documents covered every surface, organized into 3 categories he had labeled with colored tabs: financial, medical, corporate. I sat across from him each morning with coffee I never finished, watching the shape of my family's betrayal emerge in numbers and signatures and routing codes. The financial evidence came first. My father had been quietly tracking irregularities for over a year before he died. What he found was not careless. It was architectural. Evelyn had created a shell company registered under a name close enough to the family business to avoid casual scrutiny, Pembroke Property Consulting, LLC. On paper, this entity provided advisory services to the family company. In reality, it provided nothing. No reports, no consultations, no deliverables, just invoices. Over $300,000 worth of invoices over 3 years, each one approved and signed by Diane, who held signing authority on the company accounts. The money flowed from the family business into Evelyn's shell, then into her personal bank accounts. From there, it funded a life I never knew she was living. A down payment on a condominium in Santa Monica. Trips to Europe billed as business development. Designer purchases that showed up on statements with the regularity of utility bills. Diane's pattern was different but no less deliberate. She had been withdrawing from the company's emergency reserve fund for 2 years, nearly $200,000, disguised as operational costs across dozens of small transactions designed to avoid triggering internal review thresholds. The money went to credit card balances, personal renovations on the Marin County house, and monthly payments to a financial advisor who, upon closer investigation, turned out to be Diane's divorce attorney from before she married my father. She had been quietly preparing an exit strategy for years while simultaneously draining the company from the inside. I sat with those numbers and felt something beyond anger. It was the nausea of recognition. Every warm holiday invitation, every concerned phone call, every "we are family" had been camouflage for a systematic theft that started long before my father got sick. Daniel slid one more document across the table.
A wire transfer dated 3 days after my father's death. $150,000 moved from the company's operating account to Evelyn's shell entity. Authorized by Diane. They did not even wait for the funeral flowers to wilt, Daniel said. His voice was level, but I could see the disgust in his eyes. That afternoon, Grace Holloway came to the office. She looked like she had not slept in a week. She sat down across from me and folded her hands on the table and said, "I promised your father I would help you when the time came. I should have acted sooner. I am sorry." Grace explained everything. She had been my father's quiet ally inside the company for over a year. When he first suspected the financial manipulation, he could not risk hiring an outside auditor without Diane and Evelyn finding out. So he asked Grace. She copied internal documents after hours, emails between Evelyn and Diane discussing the shareholder restructuring in language that made clear their intent to strip my ownership. Board meeting minutes that had been altered after the fact to authorize transactions no legitimate vote had approved. Original shareholder agreements showing that my stake in the company was supposed to be significantly larger than what Evelyn's restructuring documents reflected. Grace smuggled the copies out in sealed envelopes and passed them to Daniel at a coffee shop across town, terrified every single time that someone would see her. Then she told me the part that made my blood stop. 2 weeks before my father died, Evelyn visited Dr. Leland, the family physician who had treated the Pembrokes for 20 years and owed a significant portion of his referral business to Diane. After that visit, my medical file in Dr. Leland's office was updated with notes I had never authorized and evaluations I had never undergone. The new entries described signs of prescription medication dependency, recommended psychological evaluation, and flagged possible cognitive impairment under stress. I never had that evaluation. I never exhibited those symptoms. Evelyn planted false medical records to build a paper trail proving I was mentally unfit. If the inheritance was ever contested, if the company restructuring ever went to court, those records would be waiting. Alexandra Pembroke. Unstable, medicated, unreliable. Her word against the word of a loving family who cared for their father until the very end. Grace's voice shook when she said it. They were not just trying to take your money, Alexandra. They were trying to erase your credibility so completely that no one would ever believe a word you said. I closed my eyes. I thought about the phone calls from relatives asking if I was eating, sleeping, thinking clearly. Diane had not just been poisoning the well. She had been laying the groundwork for a legal defense.
Every concerned whisper to every cousin was another brick in the wall they were building around me. Daniel opened the last folder. This one was different. Older. The paper inside was yellowed and brittle at the edges. He told me my father asked him to save this for last because it would be the hardest part. Inside were the original articles of incorporation for the family company, dated 1994, the founding documents of everything the Pembroke name had ever been worth, and the initial capital investment, the money that made the entire company possible, came from an account I had never seen before, an account in my mother's maiden name. Daniel explained carefully. My mother, Caroline, had funded the company from the beginning, her inheritance from her own parents, her personal savings, money she earned working 2 jobs while she was pregnant with me. She poured everything she had into my father's dream of building a real estate firm. She was the silent foundation. Without her investment, the company would never have existed. After she died, Diane erased her, methodically, completely. Caroline's name was removed from the founding documents. Her contribution was reclassified as a loan that had been repaid, though no repayment records existed anywhere. Her photographs disappeared from the office walls. Within 5 years, no one at the company even remembered that a woman named Caroline had made any of it possible. I stared at my mother's signature on the original investment paperwork. Neat handwriting, forward-leaning, confident, a woman signing her savings into a future she believed in, a future she would never see. They did not just push me out of this family. They erased my mother. They built their empire on her bones and then pretended she never existed. Daniel's phone buzzed. He read the message. I watched his expression shift, tighten, then settle into something controlled and deliberate. He looked up at me. Federal investigators have confirmed. They will be present at the will reading next Thursday. They have been building a case against Evelyn for 6 months based on the evidence your father provided before he died. He paused. Alexandra, this is not an inheritance dispute anymore. They are treating this as criminal enterprise. I sat in silence for a long time. 1 week. Everything changes in 1 week. Thursday morning. I put on a simple dark blazer and a white blouse and my mother's gold wedding band, which I had kept in a box for 20 years without once putting it on my finger. It fit perfectly. It felt like armor. I arrived at Daniel's law office 40 minutes early. The conference room was cold and institutional. Long table, leather chairs, a projector screen set up in the corner. Daniel was already there, arranging documents with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this day in his mind many times. A paralegal set up a laptop connected to the projector. At the far end of the table, 2 chairs sat empty, reserved. I asked Daniel if I should be nervous. He looked at me and said, "You should be ready. There is a difference." I sat alone for 15 minutes before anyone else arrived. I used the time to steady my breathing. My heart condition makes stress physically dangerous, so I have learned to treat calm as a discipline rather than a feeling. I touched the pill case in my jacket pocket. The medication was there. No one could take it from me this time. Diane entered first. Black cashmere, hair immaculate, expression arranged into dignified grief like a painting hung at exactly the right height. She nodded at Daniel with practiced courtesy and sat down without looking at me. To Diane, I had already been processed and dismissed. I was an obstacle, not a person. Evelyn followed. Tailored blazer, designer bag, the confident stride of a woman who had already written the ending of this story in her head. She slid into the chair across from me and smiled. I hope we can handle this like adults, Alexandra. Dad would have wanted us to be civil. I said nothing. I had learned that silence makes certain people more uncomfortable than any words could. 2 company board members arrived, both handpicked by Diane, both looking faintly bored. A notary. Evelyn's personal attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Patricia Cole, who immediately began reviewing documents with territorial efficiency. The room filled and settled. Daniel stood. Before we begin the formal reading of Robert Pembroke's last will and testament, I need to inform everyone present that additional parties will be joining us. Diane's eyebrow lifted. Evelyn's smile held, but her eyes sharpened. Additional parties? This is a private family matter. It will become clear momentarily. A knock at the conference room door. Daniel opened it. Two people in dark suits stepped inside. A man and a woman, both carrying leather folders with federal insignia visible at the edges. They took the two empty chairs at the far end of the table without introducing themselves. The room temperature dropped. Evelyn stared at the newcomers. Her smile disappeared. Daniel began reading the will. His voice was calm, deliberate, unhurried. Robert Pembroke's legally binding last will and testament, signed 14 months before his death, validated by independent psychological evaluation confirming full mental competency, 65% controlling stake in the family real estate company to Alexandra Pembroke, full authority over all personnel and financial decisions, ownership of the Marin County property. Diane would receive a fixed financial settlement and the right to reside in a secondary property. Evelyn would receive a 5% minority stake, conditional on the results of an independent financial audit. Evelyn was on her feet before he finished the last sentence. This is fraudulent. My father was not in his right mind. He had been declining for months. Everyone in this family knows that. Daniel did not flinch. He produced the independent psychological evaluation conducted by a board-certified specialist with no connection to the Pembroke family. He produced medical records from an outside physician, not Dr. Leland. Robert Pembroke had been fully lucid, fully competent, fully aware of what he was signing. The documentation was airtight. Patricia Cole leaned in and whispered urgently in Evelyn's ear. Evelyn shook her head. No, I do not accept this. Diane spoke for the first time. Her voice was controlled, thin as wire. Robert and I discussed his wishes many times. This does not reflect what he told me. Daniel replied evenly. Mrs. Pembroke, your husband specifically instructed me that his wishes were not to be discussed with any family member except his daughter Alexandra. He documented his reasons for that decision. Diane said nothing more. Her jaw tightened like a bolt being turned. The female investigator opened her leather folder. Her name was Agent Rivera. She addressed Evelyn directly in a tone that was professional, detached, and surgically precise. Evelyn Pembroke, we are conducting an active federal investigation into financial activities associated with Pembroke Property Consulting LLC, a shell entity registered under your name. We have documentation of over $300,000 in fraudulent billing to your family's company over the past 3 years. She placed transaction records on the table. Every invoice, every wire transfer, every deposit. We are also investigating an incident that occurred at the Pembroke residence approximately 5 weeks ago, involving the deliberate removal of prescribed cardiac medication from Alexandra Pembroke and the physical obstruction of her access to emergency medical treatment. This matter has been classified as reckless endangerment pending further review. She placed a photograph on the table. My pill case, recovered from Evelyn's bedroom during a search. Next to it, a printout of text messages between Evelyn and Diane from the night of the attack. One message from Diane read, "Just make sure she cannot make a scene tonight. Handle it." Evelyn stared at the photograph, at the messages, at the transaction records laid out across the table like an autopsy of her entire adult life. Patricia Cole put a hand on Evelyn's arm and said quietly, "Do not say another word." But Evelyn did not seem to hear. She was staring at the pill case in the photograph, the one she had taken from my nightstand while I was sleeping, and her face showed something I had never seen on it before. The slow, dawning recognition that there was no version of this story where she walked away clean. Agent Rivera was not finished. She laid out the complete text message history between Evelyn and Diane, not just from the night of the attack, but spanning months. Each message was printed, time-stamped, and annotated. She read them into the record one by one. Diane to Evelyn, 3 months before my father's death. She cannot find out about the restructuring until it is done. Keep her away from the office. Evelyn to Diane, 2 months before. I spoke with Dr. Leland. He will update her file. If this ever goes to court, she will look unstable. Diane to Evelyn, 1 week before the attack. If she does not sign over the shares this week, we need another approach, something that makes her want to leave on her own. Evelyn to Diane, the night she locked my door and took my medication. Done. She will not be a problem tonight. I listened to each message read aloud in Agent Rivera's flat, clinical voice. I watched Diane's face change with each one. Not crumbling exactly. More like a mask developing cracks too numerous to hold together. These were not impulsive actions by desperate women. This was a conspiracy documented in their own words, planned over months, executed methodically, with my health and my life treated as acceptable collateral damage in a business transaction. Patricia Cole was writing furiously. She knew this was indefensible. She whispered to Evelyn again. Evelyn sat rigid, jaw locked, eyes fixed on the grain of the conference table like she was trying to disappear into the wood. Diane spoke suddenly, her voice pitched higher than I had ever heard it. I never told her to hurt anyone.
Those messages are being taken out of context. Everything we did was to protect the family business from someone who was never involved in running it. Agent Rivera did not blink. Mrs. Pembroke, you are not obligated to speak at this time, and I would strongly advise you to consult with your own legal counsel before making any further statements. Diane's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in my life, I watched my stepmother reach for a script and find nothing there. Daniel took over. He turned on the projector and put a timeline on the screen, a visual map of every fraudulent transaction connected to the Pembroke family company over the previous 3 years. He walked through each entry with the patience of a man who had organized this presentation to be understood by anyone in the room, including the 2 board members who were now sitting so rigidly in their chairs that they looked like they had been nailed to them. The shell company billing, $320,000 for consulting services that never existed. Diane's withdrawals from the emergency reserve, $190,000 reclassified as operating expenses. Board meeting minutes altered after the fact to authorize transfers that no legitimate vote had ever approved. A commercial real estate acquisition in which Evelyn used company funds to purchase a property and then transferred the title to herself. Total estimated damage to the company, over $900,000. Daniel presented all of it without raising his voice. Numbers on a screen, documents with signatures, bank routing numbers tracing back to personal accounts. The precision was more devastating than anger could ever be. There was no room for interpretation, no ambiguity, no space for Diane's carefully constructed alternative reality to survive. One of the board members loosened his tie. The other stared at the projected documents with the expression of a man watching his own complicity play out in high definition. Then, Daniel paused. The room was already in ruins, but his voice shifted in a way that made everyone go still. There is one final piece of evidence that Robert Pembroke asked me to present at this meeting. He recorded it 4 months before his death, alone in his home office. He pressed play. My father's voice filled the conference room. Tired. Strained, but completely clear. Not the voice of a confused old man losing his grip on reality. The voice of a father who knew he was running out of time and had chosen to use what was left. If this recording is being played, then I am gone, and my daughter Alexandra is sitting in this room. I want everyone present to hear what I should have said years ago. Alexandra is the rightful heir to this company, not because of legal technicalities,
but because this company was built on the sacrifice and savings of her mother, Caroline. My first wife invested everything she had into our dream. She worked 2 jobs while pregnant to fund our first property acquisition. She died before she could see what her sacrifice became, and after she died, I allowed her memory to be erased from this company. I allowed her name to be removed. I allowed her photographs to disappear from these walls. I allowed another woman to take credit for what Caroline built. That is my greatest shame. I was weak. I chose comfort over truth. I chose silence over protecting my own daughter. Alexandra, I am sorry. I failed you in every way a father can fail, but I spent the last year of my life trying to make it right. Everything Daniel has is everything I could give you. I hope it is enough. You were always the best of me and your mother. Please forgive an old man who loved you but was too afraid to show it. The recording ended. The room was silent. I did not speak. I could not. Tears ran down my face, and I did not wipe them away. I let them fall onto the table, onto my hands, onto my mother's gold ring. I let everyone in that room see exactly what this cost. I was done performing composure for people who never deserved it. I looked across the table at Diane. She was staring at the surface in front of her, lips pressed into a white line, hands trembling in her lap. Whatever she was feeling, guilt or fury, or the terror of a woman whose entire construction was collapsing in real time, she kept it locked behind her face. But her hands betrayed her. Agent Rivera stood. Evelyn Pembroke, we will need you to accompany us for formal questioning regarding the financial irregularities and the incident involving your sister's cardiac medication. You are not under arrest at this time, but I strongly advise you to have legal counsel present. Patricia Cole immediately intervened. My client will cooperate through proper legal channels. But Evelyn was not listening to her attorney. She was looking at me. The conference room was silent. Everyone was watching. And in that silence, something in Evelyn's face changed. The sharpness drained out of it. The calculation disappeared. What was left underneath was smaller, younger, almost unrecognizable. A woman standing in the wreckage of the only identity she had ever known. She said, barely above a whisper, "Did he ever love me at all? Or was I always just her replacement that did not work?" I felt something I did not expect, not triumph, not satisfaction. Something closer to pity, and the sharp, uncomfortable recognition that Evelyn had also been built by Diane's architecture. Raised inside a lie so complete she never learned who she really was outside of it. I did not answer the question, not because I wanted to be cruel, because I did not know the answer. And giving a false one in either direction would have been its own kind of cruelty. The investigators escorted Evelyn toward the door. Diane stood with mechanical precision, gathered her designer purse, and walked toward the exit. She paused beside my chair, close enough that I could smell her perfume. The same perfume she had worn for 20 years. The same perfume that lingered in every room of the house where my mother's photographs used to hang. She did not look at me. She spoke quietly, almost privately, as though the words were meant for me alone. Your mother was naive, and so are you. Then she walked out, and I understood something that settled into my chest like a stone. Diane was not broken. Diane was not sorry. Diane was already planning whatever came next. Women like her do not collapse. They recalculate. I sat in the empty conference room for a long time after everyone left. Daniel offered to stay, but I asked him for a few minutes alone. I needed to sit with what had just happened without anyone watching me process it. My father's voice was still echoing in the walls. You were always the best of me and your mother. I pressed my thumb against the gold ring on my finger and turned it slowly. My mother's ring, my mother's company, my mother's legacy nearly destroyed by people who never had the right to touch it. I was not naive. I was Caroline Pembroke's daughter, and I was just getting started. The legal proceedings took 6 weeks to conclude. I did not attend every hearing. Daniel handled most of it, calling me in the evenings with updates delivered in his measured, careful voice. I listened and took notes and tried to feel something proportional to what was happening. Most days I just felt tired. Evelyn's charges were severe: reckless endangerment for the medication incident, financial fraud, embezzlement, falsification of corporate records. Her attorney fought hard, arguing that Evelyn had acted under Diane's influence, that she was a product of manipulation rather than its architect. The judge considered this, but noted that Evelyn was a grown woman who had created a shell company in her own name, signed fraudulent invoices with her own hand, and physically removed life-saving medication from her sister's nightstand with full knowledge of the consequences. The plea deal she accepted reflected all of it. 3 years of supervised probation. Full restitution of every dollar funneled through Pembroke Property Consulting LLC, 200 hours of community service, a permanent criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life, and a 10-year bar from holding any corporate officer position in any company. The woman who spent years positioning herself to run the family business could not legally sit on a board for the next decade. Diane's outcome was different but equally final. The court stripped her of all claims to the company. She was ordered to repay $190,000, withdrawn from the emergency reserve, payable over 5 years with interest. She lost the right to reside in the Marin County property. Her name was removed from every corporate document she had spent 20 years inserting herself into. There was no prison sentence. Diane had been careful enough to keep her hands technically clean on the worst of the criminal charges, letting Evelyn carry the weight of direct action while she directed from behind. But what the court took from her was, for a woman like Diane, worse than a cell: complete irrelevance. She walked out of the courthouse and disappeared into a small apartment in another city. No relatives reached out to her. No friends organized support. The structure she had spent 2 decades building simply stopped existing, and no one bothered to look for her in the rubble. I thought watching them fall would feel like victory. It did not. It felt like the end of a very long illness. The fever breaks and you are glad it is over, but you do not celebrate. You just lie there, exhausted, trying to remember what it felt like to be well. I turned my attention to the company. I did not keep it as a trophy or a weapon. I restructured it the way I would have restructured any distressed asset, methodically, without sentiment, using the same skills that had made me a successful broker when I had nothing and no one behind me. I fired the board members who had enabled Diane's financial manipulation for years, the ones who sat in that conference room loosening their ties while federal investigators laid out the evidence of their complicity. I promoted Grace Holloway to Director of Operations. The woman who risked her career and her safety to help my father gather evidence deserved more than gratitude. She deserved authority. I sold the properties that had been acquired through Evelyn's fraudulent transactions, returning the proceeds to the company's balance sheet where they belonged. I kept the core portfolio, the original properties my mother's investment had made possible 3 decades ago, the foundation she built, the part of this company that was always real. Then I did the thing that mattered most. I renamed the company's founding branch office. The old sign came down on a Tuesday morning, and a new brass plate was mounted beside the front door. It read, Caroline Pembroke and Associates, established 1994. My mother's name, restored to the building she made possible, back where Diane had spent 20 years making certain it would never appear. I stood outside that office for a long time, looking at the letters engraved in brass. A small thing, a plate on a brick wall, but it represented the reversal of an erasure so thorough that even I had nearly forgotten my mother's role in building everything my family had ever been worth. I touched the plate with my fingertips and felt each letter under my skin, and for the first time since my father died, what I felt was not grief. It was presence, my mother's presence, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a foundation, solid, permanent, finally, publicly, undeniably acknowledged. Inside the office, on my desk, sat a framed photograph. My mother standing in front of the original storefront on opening day, 1994. Young, radiant, one hand resting on her pregnant belly. Pregnant with me. Daniel had kept the photo for years, per my father's instructions.
"He told me to give it to you when the truth finally came out," Daniel said when he handed it over. "He hid it because he was ashamed he let her be forgotten, but he could never bring himself to throw it away. I used a significant portion of my inheritance to create the Caroline Pembroke Fund, a legal aid program providing free representation to people facing financial manipulation within families and family-owned businesses, elder financial abuse, adult children whose inheritance was stolen by step-parents or siblings, spouses trapped in marriages built on financial control, the people who sit in kitchens at midnight, wondering if anyone will ever believe them. I hired a small team. Grace helped me build partnerships with local firms willing to take pro bono cases. Within 6 months, the fund had assisted over 40 families. One of them was a 70-year-old widow whose son-in-law had been draining her retirement account for years. Our attorneys helped her recover nearly everything. She sent me a handwritten note that said simply, "Someone finally believed me." I kept that note in my desk drawer. On hard days, I read it. Life became quieter. I had Sunday dinners with Ruth, my father's younger sister, who had finally stepped out of the shadow Diane had cast over the entire family for 2 decades. Ruth brought old photographs and stories I had never heard. My parents on their first date. My mother laughing in a garden. My father young and hopeful and not yet broken by the choices he would make. I listened to every word and held them carefully, filling in the blank spaces of a history I had been locked out of my entire life. One evening after dinner, Ruth put down her coffee cup and looked at me with an expression I could not quite name. "Your father told me something once, years ago. He said Alexandra is the only one of us who turned out brave." She paused. I think he was right. I did not respond to the compliment. I poured more coffee and changed the subject. I have never been comfortable with praise, but I kept those words somewhere safe inside my chest, next to the photograph and the ring and the brass letters of my mother's name. 3 months after the proceedings ended, a letter arrived at my office. No return address. Handwriting I recognized immediately as Evelyn's, though it looked different now. Shaky, uncertain. Nothing like the sharp, controlled script I remembered from the emails she used to send threatening legal action. The letter did not contain an apology. Not exactly. It said, "I do not know how to be a person without the story Mom built around me. I am in therapy. I am trying. I do not know if I will ever fully understand what I did to you, but I heard Dad's recording, every word, and I cannot unhear it." It ended. "I am not asking for forgiveness. I am asking if there is a version of the future where we are not enemies." I put the letter in my desk drawer next to the widow's note and the photograph of my mother. I did not reply. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I did not throw it away. Some doors you leave open, not because you are weak, but because you are strong enough to decide later. Yesterday evening I stood by the window of my office and watched the sun go down over Sacramento. The building was quiet. My heart medication sat on the corner of my desk, a small daily reminder that my body is fragile, but my will is not. I picked up the framed photograph. My mother, 1994, hand on her belly, smiling at a future she would never see, but somehow trusted completely. I whispered to the empty room. "I kept it, Mom. Everything you built. I kept it." Then I set the photo down, turned off the light, and walked out into the evening. I shared this story today because I spent 37 years believing I was the only one living it.
I was not. And if you are listening right now and something felt familiar, the silence, the manipulation, the feeling of being erased by the people who were supposed to love you, then I need you to hear this. You are not crazy. You are not dramatic. You are not alone. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you. Have you ever had to fight to be seen by your own family? What gave you the courage to finally stand up? Leave a comment and tell me, because your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if you want more stories like this, stories about truth and justice and people who refuse to disappear, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss one. I will see you in the next one.